In this video, let us see how we can find our server name before connecting to SQL Server database. So to find our server name, we need to understand what is actually our system name. Suppose if you are trying to install our SQL Server in our system, then it takes our system name itself a server name. Suppose if I have a system name Dilip, then my server name is also called as Dilip. Right. Now here there are two scenarios. Let me just explain you in the case one. Suppose I have a system here. I have a system here. Okay. Let me just say that this system is system 1, and I can also call it as machine 1. And here my system name is Dilip. Let me just say this system name is Dilip. So in this system, I have installed an SQL server. Okay, SQL server, and in SQL server I have a database, right? I have a database. Now in this I have user here, because SQL server and user are in the same system. When SQL server and user are in the same system, then my server name will be equal to DILIP. Can also be a name, and it can also be called as localhost. But here remember one thing: when you have your user and SQL server in one system, then that server name can be called as localhost or Dilip. But if this user and SQL server are in different systems, then we cannot use a server name called localhost in that case. Let us see that another scenario. Let's say that it is our case 2 here. Okay. So in the next case 2, here in this case we have a system here. Okay, we have a system here. Let's say this system name is XYZ. Okay, and this is our system 1 or machine 1. Okay, now we also have another system here. Let's say the system name is ABC, and this is our system 2 or machine 2. Now here we have user in this system. Okay, but we have SQL server in another system. Let's say this is our SQL server. In this we have a database. Now in this case my server name will be ABC, right? Here we cannot use our server name as localhost, because we have here user and SQL server in different systems. So this is a very important to remember. Now let's move on to the other topic. Our third option is authentication. Let's talk a little bit about authentication. So why we need authentication basically? authentication we need to verify our credentials, right? So this we require for an entry level, like authentication required to verify our user credentials, like user ID and password. Now, when we are using, when we are assigning the user credentials, right, user and password, who actually can do this? It can be done through database administrator. Database administrator, right? Now, here in this authentication, we have two modes. One is Windows authentication and one is Windows authentication, and the other one is SQL Server authentication. Now, when we are saying Windows authentication, right, it is by default actually. It is by default. Now, here there are two things again. One is we'll have two radio buttons here. One is default. So here by default, we're trying to use a Windows authentication while installing Windows, while installing SQL Server. By default, when we have entered this default radio button, then during installation, this SQL Server software will have an access to the server for Windows only, right? This will have an access for the server with Windows only. Suppose in case if we have kept an option for, we have another option here called mixed, right? In this case, during installation, during installation, this SQL software, here we can have access for Windows as well as SQL Server authentication. Windows as well as SQL Server. That is why we are calling it as mixed. Now let us go and explore further, like what actually happens in this authentication mode, right? So we have here, let me just write it again. In the authentication modes, we have here Windows authentication, and we also have here SQL Server authentication. So Windows authentication is by default, okay? Now by default, when we connect to database server, here the role is called admin. Admin means we have all rights, right? But when we have connected through SQL Server authentication, here we connect to database server, okay? Here the role is user. Here we cannot play a role of admin, okay? Here we cannot directly use the operations like select. We cannot perform any kind of a command operations here. Insert table, delete table, insert, like wise operations we cannot perform in the user. only when we get a rights from the admin, then only we can use here. So here, to perform any kind of operations, we need to get a permission from admin. So these are the basic differences between Windows authentication and SQL Server authentication. Here, when we are connecting the SQL Server through Windows authentication, that means he's having all rights. Here he is like a boss. But when somebody is connecting through with SQL Server authentication, that means he is not having any admin rights. Here he is like an employee. To get any kind of permission, he needs to ask a permission from his boss. So this is about two modes of authentication. One is Windows authentication and the other one is SQL Server authentication. Now here, when we finish this, we have another two options which are called as username and password. Username and password, right? Now username, by default we get it as SA means system administrator, right? Now while installing the SQL server, we give a password, right? This can be a user or an admin at the time of installation. Here also we have two things. One is default mode and the other one is mixed mode. Okay. Now when we have select here a mixed mode, then we need to enter here username. Let us say here DILIP, and again it will ask to enter password. Here I will just enter here KUMAR. Now again it will ask us to confirm password. Here I can just say that again, KUMAR. So these are basically the options while entering the username and password. So these options are given while installing this SQL Server database, while after selecting all authentications, and then you can just see some other options like server name, like that, right? So here we also have this kind of options. We need to be very careful while mentioning the username and password. We can connect all this whenever we require to connect the SQL server. So this is about a um, basic structure how we can actually perform the connections for SQL database. With some more things, I'll see you in the next video. Thank you for watching.